Welcome to Nice and Blunt. My name is Adam Riancho, and for today's video, we're going to talk about the tight end position, go through basically my top 32 at the position. I'm really going to go in-depth on the top 20, but we're talking more holistically about the tight end position overall. And before I get into my rankings, just a reminder, I did go over the top 10, which I think are really the critical names you need this year in order to compete. The reason why, I'm going to illustrate through a few graphs.
Look at this graph!
Here on the screen, I have all of last year's tight ends, 1 through 32, ranked in order in terms of points per game. And what you can clearly see when looking at this chart is that there are massive tier breaks at the position. There's the top 4 that put up between 11.7, 11.3. The top 7 all have more than 10 points per game, but there's almost a 2-point gap between tight end 7 and tight end 8. Kmet drops down to 8.5 points per game. Then 8 through 12 down to 8.1. They're all kind of the same type of player. Then tight end 13 through 16, 7.6 to 7.1. And then it just slowly trickles down all the way down to Michael Mayer at number 32 with 4 points per game. And it's not like you can't compete at all with some of the players later on in the rankings, but they're just going to have like pockets of greatness, not necessarily a full season. Isaiah Likely, for instance, who's down near the bottom, averaging 5.1, he was well above the top 10 when Mark Andrews was hurt. So there are some contingent factors, but overall you're looking for 10 plus points per game, and if you're not getting a top 7 tight end, it's kind of hard to compete. But overall, the metrics in terms of targets per game that we're looking for, at least 5.5 is really correlating well with success. 5.7 is kind of the number you're hoping to hit. But once you dip below 5, it's very difficult. In terms of receptions, you're looking for at least 4 catches per game as well. All of the higher scorers last year were in this top half of at least 4 catches per game. In terms of touchdowns per game, 0.3 is really the mark that you're hoping to hit. That's an average of about 5 touchdowns over a 17-game season. And if you're getting less than that, you're more likely than not to be ranked far, far lower. But in terms of yardage per game, you're really competing if you have 50 to 65 yards per game, like Kelsey was number 1 with 65. And once you dip below 50, you still have a chance, but below 40, you might as well count yourself out. It's highly touchdown dependent after that point. So these are the graphs I just wanted to illustrate to you to really explain how you should be grasping the tight end position. You only have to start 1. So it's not like it's that critical you get the number 1 tight end, but if you don't get a top 10 guy, it is very difficult to predict who is going to keep you viable. On a week-to-week basis, they're very touchdown and matchup dependent. But with that in mind, let us move on to the rankings. I already gave you my top 10, and if you're looking for more optimistic outlooks on players, go ahead and check out that video over on my channel. But we're going to get a little more pessimistic as we trickle down through the rankings. But number 11 in my ranks is Brock Bowers of the Las Vegas Raiders. Bowers does offer you the potential to give you top 5 production at a discount if he can indeed live up to the hype as a rookie tight end. We've been disappointed by first-round tight ends in the past, like Kyle Pitts. TJ Hockenson had a slow start. Noah Fant has never really gotten going. And despite a record year from Sam Laporta last season, he was drafted in round 2 and was in a very good spot. Guys like Dalton Kincaid, Michael Mayer, drafted above him, were not as productive, nor did they have as good of a situation. There were kind of more target competition overall. And this is where I'm concerned for Brock Bowers. I agree that he's talented. He's 6'3", 245 pounds with 32-inch arms and also runs a 4.53 40 that ranks in the 96th percentile overall at the position in terms of speed, and Player Profiler does comp him very well to Travis Kelce. So all of that is exciting, encouraging. In college, he was also very dominant in the SEC as soon as his rookie year for Georgia, when he put up 56 catches for 882 yards and 13 touchdowns in 15 games back in 2021. He was even better in year 2, also in 15 games, posting 63 catches for 942 yards and 7 touchdowns. He played 5 fewer games last year in 2023, but was still the best weapon for that Georgia Bulldogs offense. He had fewer total yards, but actually increased all of his stats on a per game basis. He just played 5 fewer games. That's why these numbers don't look as good when you just look at the raw totals. But in addition, he was also used in the run game, a bit of a dual threat athlete, and he scored an additional 5 touchdowns in his college career on 19 rush attempts, over 10 yards per carry. Very impressive from the tight end. And when the Raiders did draft him at 13th overall in this year's draft, it definitely wasn't their biggest position of need. They just drafted Michael Mayer the year prior, but he was definitely the best player available. I don't really blame them for taking him where they did once Bo Nix and all the quarterbacks were off the board. Didn't really have much of a choice. This landing spot is ultimately, though, my biggest concern for Brock Bowers. There have been reports that the LA Rams were trying to trade up for Bowers, and if that happened, I would have maybe put him above Trey McBride. I would have been way higher on Bowers, but he was not, and he's going to play with either Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell at quarterback. That's a massive downgrade from a guy like Stafford, and those guys would be backups on almost any other NFL team. He'll be competing with Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers for targets on a run-first offense that also leans on their defense. He does make Michael Mayer completely irrelevant. He's definitely their best tight end, but Mayer was highly touted last year and really struggled as well. So I'm not convinced he finds his footing immediately on the same team. I think Bowers is definitely much more talented. I just don't think it's safe to assume that this Raiders offense is going to pan out well. I really don't. He should probably see upwards of 90 targets this year. I feel like they would be foolish not to send him that type of volume given the draft capital, but I'm worried there's just not enough touchdowns to make him relevant for fantasy either. This ranking could be 3 or 4 spots too low. It could also be 4 or 5 spots too high, and you might get a massive bust. Drafting him above David Njoku overall. I'm not expecting the world from Bowers. He's got elite upside, but it just feels too risky for my taste. At an ADP of tight end 10, pick 96 overall. I have him in a tier below Njoku, who you can get 4 picks later. And the tight ends I view in the same tier go at least a full round, if not 2 later sometimes. So I'm not someone who's drafting or targeting Bowers that often. If he falls to me, sure, I'll take him. But I'd much rather draft a quarterback like Dak, Jordan Love, or Jaden Daniels in the 9th round. I would also much rather take Josh Palmer, David Njoku, or Brian Robinson, who are all going later. So buyer beware when drafting Bowers. I think there's just a little too much hype surrounding him, and the price is a little too high for my liking. I can definitely envision a path for him to pay off at his draft price, but I'm just not trying to bet on it. I think he resembles most rookie tight ends at the end of the year, players who historically do not offer league-winning value in fantasy football. Number 12, though, is Dallas Goedert in the very same tier, who is very interesting and kind of hard to rank sometimes. If you watched my channel last year, I highly recommended drafting him, but after losing Shane Steichen, he was probably the biggest fantasy loser with a new offensive coordinator in Philadelphia, who really struggled to figure out how to use him properly. He's still capable of being the tight end 1 in fantasy in any given week. Just look at week 5 last year at the Rams, where he caught 8 of 9 targets for 117 yards and 1 touchdown. It was a good matchup, though. He scored 21.7 points in that game, but it felt like that was mostly a get-right game for him, where they force-fed him the ball after completely failing to get him properly involved the first month of the year. In his first 4 games, he was terrible, averaging just 3.8 points per game on 4.8 targets per game, 3.3 receptions per game for only 22 yards and no touchdowns. He was never getting targeted deeper than 5 yards past the line of scrimmage. Sometimes it was behind the line of scrimmage, and why the fuck would you use your tight end as the screen guy? I don't understand that logic when you have other playmakers like Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. So he was atrocious that first month of the season. After week 5, they got him far more involved in the offense, though. In his final 9 full games, not counting week 18, where he barely played, he actually put up top 8 numbers at the tight end position. On a per-game basis, Goedert was scoring 10.1 points per game. He saw 6.8 targets per game, caught 5 receptions per game for 56 yards per game, and scored 3 touchdowns. He was a weekly top 10 tight end. However, he also broke his arm at the end of week 9 versus Dallas. He missed the bye week right after that, and 3 games with his injury. His numbers took a slight dip after the broken arm. He averaged only 8.5 points per game. So there was really like 3 chapters to his season last year. Terrible in the first month, excellent from weeks 5 through 9, 5-game stretch of very high production, and then he was usable but just average, nothing incredible after breaking his arm. So it's important to put his 2023 season-long numbers into context when evaluating him. His targets did increase from 2022, but for the second straight year, his per-game stats did go down, and he finished the year with 83 targets, 53 catches for 592 yards, and 3 touchdowns in 14 games. He was tight end 13 on a per-game basis with 7.6 points per game. But I expect him to play better this year with a new offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore. I think that's a significant improvement over Brian Johnson. Moore has been good for fantasy tight ends in the past. Gerald Everett may not have been elite last season, but if we look back to Dalton Schultz in his last 2 years in Dallas, he averaged 9.1 points per game, which last year would have been tight end 8 on a per game basis, and 7 touchdowns per every 17 games with the Cowboys. So Goedert can absolutely return on investment with a ADP of tight end 12, pick 115 overall. He could be a very good pick actually at that price. He could definitely pay off as the tight end 8, but the last remaining factor with Goedert is his health. He's actually gotten hurt at a very consistent rate, with the exception of his rookie season when he was competing behind Zach Ertz. He has actually never played a full season besides that rookie year. He's missed a total 16 games in the last 5 years, so you should expect at least 3 missed games from him due to injury yet again in 2024, just like last year with the broken arm. That was the case, and that's why I think he's being drafted at an appropriate value here at tight end 12. It's exactly where I rank him. He might be slightly better than Bowers this year in points per game, but probably not enough to compensate for his injury risk, and I'm not drafting him like crazy, to be honest. If I'm not stacking him with Jalen Hurts, I'm really just looking for him to fall to me past ADP, maybe coming back around at the next turn, rather than take him at or above his ADP. He's fine. I don't think you're going to be upset when you draft him. You're definitely not going to lose your league with him, barring a season-ending injury, but I don't think he's going to be a league winner either. I think the difference is pretty marginal. I think round 10 has a tier break in quarterback and wide receiver values. I'd much rather draft Brandon Cooks, Dontavian Wicks, Brock Purdy especially. Even Caleb Williams or Trevor Lawrence, I think, are better picks in that range. So I don't think he's a must draft this season. You could take him, you could leave him. It's kind of up in the air. Not that necessary to target him. But moving on, at number 13 is possibly my favorite player in this tier, at least. He's a guy I just can't give up on. It's Pat Freiermuth of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he is the last player in this tier. He represents a tremendous value, in my opinion, going off the board as tight end 13, pick 129 on Underdog, and with a price 14 picks cheaper than Goedert, as well as 33 picks cheaper than Brock Bowers. He's actually my most drafted tight end at a rate of 17% this offseason. I think he can profile as one of the best backup tight ends. If he's your tight end 2, you're in great shape. But if you punt the position and wait to take him as your tight end 1, I still think you can compete at a decent rate. You probably still need to invest in 3 tight ends total if that is your strategy. But there is a path for top 10 production this year, as long as his touchdowns increase, as well as his per game usage significantly increases, at least from last year back to what we saw when he was a rookie. I believe it will, because the Steelers' offense is devoid of receiving talent at the moment. There's a chance they trade for Ayuk, but until that happens, I can't really change this ranking. I'm operating with what I know. And I do know that the Steelers traded away Deontay Johnson and replaced him only with rookie wide receiver Roman Wilson out of Michigan in the 3rd round. And reports indicate that he is struggling to beat out Van Jefferson on this depth chart. So behind George Pickens, it's strictly Pat Freiermuth and pass-catching running back Jaylen Warren. Those are the only legitimate threat for targets aside from Freiermuth. So barring a trade for Ayuk, Freiermuth is a lock to be the number 2 target in this Steelers offense. Reports from training camp earlier this year point to Russell Wilson developing very good chemistry with Freiermuth early on, and that's a quarterback we've seen favor the tight end in the past, especially in the red zone. If we look to Jimmy Graham's stats, there was a year where Jimmy Graham put up 10 touchdowns on the season. So Freiermuth has had very productive fantasy years in the past. If we look back to his rookie season, Freiermuth had 60 catches for 497 yards and 7 touchdowns with Ben Roethlisberger. He struggled to score touchdowns with Kenny Pickett at quarterback the last 2 years, but as a sophomore in the league on 98 targets, he did catch 63 receptions for 732 yards and scored 2 touchdowns. Only 9 tight ends had more yards in the NFL last year. So if he can get back to that type of production, he will definitely pay off from a floor standpoint. As tight end 13, I think that would be his floor. But last year was a massive disappointment in fantasy, finishing as tight end 30 on a per game basis. He averaged only 4.9 points per game. He struggled with injuries and was never able to develop chemistry with any of the backup quarterbacks once Pickett got benched. He did have a blow-up game in Week 12, though, at the Bengals, where he caught 9 of 11 targets for 120 yards, which does speak to his talent and overall potential upside, but it wasn't consistent enough to really convince anyone that he can do it a lot. But that was truly the only bright spot in an otherwise atrocious year from a stat line perspective. His lack of production in 2023 was a major red flag. And I understand if you are not interested in drafting him this season because of that, but there's 2 reasons why I'm so bullish on him bouncing back this year. As I mentioned, the target competition with no Deontay Johnson or Allen Robinson, that frees up 136 targets in this offense from last season. But more importantly, his new offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith, does love to send targets to the tight end position. Last year in Atlanta, Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith combined for a total 160 targets. And dating back to 2020, when he was the offensive coordinator in Tennessee, Arthur Smith sends an average of 143 targets per year to the tight end position overall over a 4-year sample size. So not only is Freiermuth going to be heavily targeted by necessity, but also by design in Arthur Smith's offense. If he can stay healthy, I think he will be at the very least a solid return on investment tight end 13 this season. Last year, tight end 13 was Dallas Goedert, averaging 7.6 points per game, and he only scored 3 touchdowns in 14 games. So Freiermuth could easily drop 5 or more touchdowns this season, and if he can surpass the 7 touchdowns he scored as a rookie, it's not impossible, he would most likely finish as a top 10 tight end pretty easily. So I think you're drafting him at his floor. The only way this doesn't work out is if all of a sudden blocking tight end Darnell Washington gets far more targeted in the red zone. That would definitely fuck this up. I don't think it's completely beyond the scope of what Arthur Smith might be willing to do. He's kind of an unpredictable play caller. It might happen, but I'm willing to bet against it. I'm ready to take my chances. Once again, with Freiermuth, I believe in his talent. If he indeed has good chemistry with Russell Wilson, then I'm not worried about it. But even if Fields becomes the starting quarterback in Pittsburgh, I think there is still high upside because last year Cole Kmet was clearly the definitive number 2 target in Chicago as well. And he finished as the tight end 8 last year with 8.5 points per game in 17 games with 90 targets, 73 catches, 719 yards, and 6 touchdowns. This is not an unreasonable stat line to project for Pat Freiermuth. So it might be optimistic, but if it does happen, it could very easily outscore guys like Kyle Pitts, David Njoku, Brock Bowers, and Dallas Goedert, the tight ends I have ranked 9 through 12 above him on the list. I would never put him above Jake Ferguson. I think tight end 9 is kind of the ceiling for Freiermuth, but I recommend taking a shot on him. I think at the worst, he's tight end 15. Best case scenario, he's top 10, and that's what you need in order to compete. If he's your tight end 2, you are in great shape, but even as the tight end 1, I think you have a realistic chance to compete. Moving on, though, to tight end 14, I have a player in a tier of his own. It's TJ Hockenson of the Minnesota Vikings. And the only reason he ranks this low is because on Christmas Eve last year, he tore his ACL on a pretty nasty hit. He is currently on the PUP list, and no one is expecting him to be ready for week 1. That's very unrealistic. That's why his price is so cheap. On Underdog, he's being drafted as tight end 16 pick 143 overall. But if he is healthy, he could put up top 3 numbers at the position. That's what he did last year. In 2023, he was tight end 2 in points per game with 11.6. He played in 15 games and was on pace for 144 targets, which would have led the position if he had finished the season. With 95 catches, 960 yards, and 5 touchdowns, he was arguably the most consistent fantasy tight end before he got hurt, unfortunately, for the fantasy championship. But he did benefit from Justin Jefferson missing time, but even with Kirk Cousins getting injured, he did become the favorite target of the backup quarterbacks until Jefferson was back healthy, of course. But unlike Jordan Addison, his usage never took a hit without Kirk Cousins. He remained a focal point in Kevin O'Connell's offense, regardless of quarterback play, and that's why I'm not worried about his numbers this year if he plays with Sam Darnold. The rookie J.J. McCarthy is pretty unpredictable, and that could be a big red flag, honestly. We have no idea what to expect. I think it could look like shit, but if it would look like shit, I think they would just keep Sam Darnold under center and avoid that scenario. But overall, I think even McCarthy could probably keep his fantasy viability pretty high given the opportunity, and especially in tournament settings where you're searching for late round upside in weeks 15, 16, 17 when the payouts occur, I think he's still an excellent value that you should look to target for tight end depth. Despite being on the PUP list right now, reports indicate he is ahead of schedule, and I can't tell you exactly what that means. I'm not 100% sure when he steps back on the field. I really have no idea. I'm just guessing. But I do think there's a chance it could be as early as week 7 following the Vikings bye in week 6. There is no fucking chance it's before week 6, though. They play in London week 5, and I don't see why they would even bring him on the plane. So there's no chance it happens before that Jets game. But if we start to see him practicing in September as early as week 3 or 4, then he could get ramped up starting in week 7. And by the time we hit week 10, maybe he's as close to 100% as he'll be this year. So the snaps, I think, will be pretty reasonable in the second half of the year. I think you will get at least 2 months of production from TJ Hockenson, if not more. And the bonus to having that bye in week 5 is that once he's back on the field in the second half, you're never going to miss out on like a week 13, week 14 matchup from TJ Hockenson. He is going to be recovering during that missed game bye week. So that's definitely a little bonus there. And barring another injury, I think he's going to be close to what he was last year. He should be better and better as the weeks go on, and that means in the final few weeks, when you need him most in fantasy tournaments and the fantasy playoffs, that is who we want. There is league-winning potential with TJ Hockenson. But given the potential upside, I think he's fallen too much. Obviously, you could get burned by drafting him, but that literally applies to every single tight end I have ranked below him as well. The only problem is, unlike them, you're not going to be willing to drop TJ Hockenson if you do draft him. His upside is too high, and if you find yourself at like 3 and 5 by the time he's healthy out of the playoff picture, you might feel a little desperate, especially if you're like 2 and 6 maybe, and you're just like willing to unload him in a trade to maybe a team that's like 6 and 1, 7 and 2. You might feel really desperate later mid-season, and you might miss out on all the value that he actually has because he's plugging up your bench and prevents you from picking up guys off the waiver wire that might help you win. So that's my only reason to completely avoid him. Roster flexibility is going to be the biggest issue here for fantasy purposes. But if your league offers you the chance to put him on IR immediately after drafting him, then I think you should take him, because then you can pick up somebody else for your bench depth and you can use that spot all season long until he gets back. So as long as you have an IR spot, I think you should be targeting TJ Hockenson. I think he could be a key piece for winning your championship this year. If he's able to return to form by week 10, you will be very happy. You took him, the price completely bakes in that risk, and I think the upside is worth gambling on. Now, though, we move on to the final tier of the top 20, where you could argue we've already been discussing touchdown-dependent tight ends to this point. I ranked Kyle Pitts at number 9, and I feel like everyone, including him, is very touchdown-dependent, honestly. But here is where I think it's most critical, given the situation that these players find themselves in, whether it's too much target competition or a terrible offense and quarterback combo. But I think these are the best streamers in 2024 who, if you start, you are either looking to bank a 5 to 6 point floor or praying for a touchdown that could lead to 10 plus points, or maybe only like 8 points if that's like one of their only catches. So here we go. At tight end 15, I have Dalton Schultz, who was actually pretty solid last year. If you look at his stats in Houston, he scored 5 touchdowns in 15 games, an average of 8.2 points per game. That was tight end 11 on a per game basis. He's actually been on a very consistent pace over the last 4 years, averaging 1 touchdown every 3 games in the league. So that's the rate that we're looking for. As I mentioned earlier with those graphs, at least 0.3 touchdowns per game is what you need to compete. But he's also seen at least 88 targets in the last 4 years as well. But I am expecting a pretty significant decrease in targets this year with the addition of Stephon Diggs in Houston. He's pretty much always been the number 3 target at worst in his offense since 2020 back in Dallas, but now he's clearly number 4 at best. He could also be competing with running back Joe Mixon for targets, and I wouldn't be shocked if he had fewer receptions than Mixon next year. If he's the 5th guy in this Texans offense, then he's just going to be very inconsistent from a yardage standpoint week to week. It's going to be a very inconsistent floor, and that makes his upside entirely dependent on scoring touchdowns. CJ Stroud in that Houston offense is going to score a lot of points this season, but barring an injury to one of those wide receivers, there's just too many mouths to feed to keep him viable, in my opinion. I think those touchdowns will be coming down. I think 4 or 3 is definitely a realistic outlook for him, and I think given the price you have to pay in order to get him, he's a player I'm avoiding on Underdog with an ADP of tight end 14, pick 131 overall. Freiermuth recently overtook him in ADP. Before that happened, I was always passing on him for Freiermuth. So now I think he's a little more interesting, but unless I have CJ Stroud and I'm trying to stack him, I think at that price, it's still even too expensive. I think it's kind of just unjustified. He's a fine number 2 backup at tight end on your roster. I think there will be some upside overall, but I have other guys going much later ranked in the same tier, and that's why I don't recommend reaching on Schultz at all. You'll probably be able to pick him up off of waivers mid-season when someone inevitably drops him after being disappointed. That's probably going to happen, I think. So all of these guys are going to be on the waiver wire at some point, most likely, unless it's a very competitive league at tight end, and that's why no one is really worth targeting like crazy in your draft. And number 16 is a tight end in a very similar situation to Schultz. It's Kmet of the Chicago Bears, and he was very productive last season in Chicago. He played all 17 games. He finishes the tight end 8 in points per game with an average of 8.5, but this year he gets a massive uptick in target competition, and at the best, he is the number 4 weapon in the Bears' new offense. Dalton Schultz only gets Stephon Diggs joining his roster, but Kmet now has to deal with Keenan Allen joining the team, in addition to 9th overall pick Rome Odunze, as well as veteran tight end Gerald Everett, who they added in free agency. Everett is an afterthought, honestly, but Keenan and Rome legitimately scare me for this year's outlook on Kmet. I just don't see how a rookie quarterback is going to keep all 4 of these players viable on a weekly basis. And I feel like Kmet is most likely the odd man out. If he's not, then probably 2 of those receivers are going to massively disappoint. But I think it's more likely that one of the receivers and Kmet are not heavily targeted, and I would rather just invest in the receivers on this team and ignore the tight end. So unless one of those guys gets injured and misses a significant amount of time, I see almost no scenario where Kmet pays off his tight end 15 ADP. I have him 1 spot lower, but overall in my mind, I think he should be going several rounds later. He would have to score at least 5, 6 plus touchdowns in order to even come close to that. And I do understand that he scored 13 touchdowns over the last 2 seasons, but the targets are just destined to come down, and that's really going to impact his value overall. He's seen 90 plus targets in 2 of the last 3 years, but 3 years ago in his breakout season, he also scored 0 touchdowns in 17 games on 93 targets. It's possible that that happens again. It would be a nightmare if he didn't find the end zone once in 2024. So I'm very concerned that offensive coordinator Shane Waldron, formerly of the Seahawks, is going to forget about him, because for the last 2 years, he's had a legit athletic tight end in Noah Fant and has failed to offer him legitimate fantasy production. Last year, Noah Fant didn't score a touchdown either, and it's possible we see that for Kmet. So I'm terrified what will happen to him. I think there's some really high bust potential here and not a massive amount of upside for him to like all of a sudden be a top 10 tight end again. I think would be shocking. So maybe there's a chance that they, for some stupid reason, decide to incorporate Gerald Everett as well. That would be terrible. And while Kmet is very talented, I think he will have a few spike weeks here and there. But establishing chemistry with Caleb Williams is just not guaranteed to happen. And despite being the 8th highest paid tight end for the next 4 years at $12.5 million per season, I do not want to bet on him in fantasy until Keenan Allen is out of Chicago. Until that happens, I just think it's a tough bet to make. And at number 16, I honestly feel like I am not low enough on him with this ranking. On Underdog, he's being drafted as tight end at 15, pick 142 overall. And at that price, I'd rather just take a swing on TJ Hockenson, who's going a couple picks later. There's a slim chance that Cole Kmet does pay off as the number 4 target with a rookie QB. I think at best he's in the bucket of streamers at the position this year, and he's dependent on an injury to someone else in order to work out, and I'd rather get him off the waiver wire than draft him. I recommend you pass on Cole Kmet. Next up, though, at number 17 is probably the tight end you've seen me target the most when I draft a late one on the live stream. Tyler Conklin, I think, has very underrated upside. This year, he's being drafted as the tight end 20, pick 169 on Underdog. So while that upside is probably unlikely, I only have him at number 17. I think you're at worst drafting him at his floor, because for 3 straight years, dating back to 2021 in Minnesota, he's played all 17 games, never missed one, and seen exactly 87 targets year over year over year. If he stays healthy, I think his 60 catch floor for 589 yards per season will repeat once again, and not counting any touchdowns, that's a weekly guarantee of 5.2 points per game on average. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that's elite, but it's definitely safe. Tight end is a position that can easily burn you for less than 2 points in a random game, and if the guy doesn't score a touchdown, you're almost never getting 6+ points anyways. So if all you're trying to do is just not get a 0 at the position and bank 5 to 6 points in a bye week fill-in, or while your starter misses like 3-4 games, then Conklin is one of the safest bets that you can make to do that. He's in no way a flashy pick. Not a soul in your draft is going to be jealous that you sniped them on Tyler Conklin in the final round of the draft. If anything, he probably deserves to go undrafted this year and be strictly a waiver wire option. But with Aaron Rodgers playing quarterback for the Jets, there is a slight chance that Conklin has a breakout year in touchdown production at the age of 29. Over the last 3 years, he has maxed out at 3 touchdowns. That's probably what's going to happen again. But after failing to score a touchdown with Zach Wilson last year, I think he is due for positive regression in that department. We know this offense is going to be much improved with Rodgers under center, and with an improved offensive line, he should stay healthy for the majority of the season as well. Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall are undoubtedly the top 2 weapons for the Jets. I wouldn't be shocked at all if Breece is second on the team in targets, but the third option is completely up for grabs. Mike Williams was brought in to be that guy, but he's always dealing with injuries. He's on the PUP list at the moment, and you really never know. He could get injured week 2 for the rest of the year. Again, no one would be shocked. And we don't even know when he's going to be healthy. So at the moment, it looks like rookie 3rd-round pick Malachi Corley is competing with Lazard for that number 3 job. Maybe Mike Williams takes it. We really have no idea. There's potential for Corley and Lazard to score touchdowns. That's definitely happened in the past with Lazard. But it's completely up for grabs, and there's no reason to discount Tyler Conklin as potentially the guy in the red zone for Rodgers. There's definitely a chance where he exceeds that 87 target floor he's been giving us and not only steps into the third target in the Jets offense, but also sneaks his way into 7+ touchdowns over the course of the season. We've seen this happen before with Aaron Rodgers in 2020. Robert Tonyan was a league winner, scoring 11 touchdowns on just 59 targets, and he was also someone who went undrafted that year. So this is the upside I'm hoping for, I'm leaning into when I draft him on Underdog and rank him this high. From a floor standpoint, I think he's a fine pick as tight end 20. But from an upside standpoint, there is a world where he does finish as a top 12, potentially top 10 upside. It's just a matter of will the touchdowns hit or not. If I'm wrong, you can drop him right away if you're seeing he's not getting a big role in this offense, and you won't have any regrets about it. You can definitely stream the position. You're back in that same scenario. But if I'm right, then, oh boy, this really works out. And while I am probably going to leave him undrafted in my redraft league, it's possible that we hit week 3 and he's the most highly coveted tight end off the waiver wire if he scores like back-to-back touchdowns the first 2 games. So I think he's worth gambling on in the 15th round on Underdog. There is some league-winning potential, but at number 17, I'm not expecting the world at the end of the day. Moving on, though, at number 18, I have Luke Musgrave of the Green Bay Packers, who's a bit of a wild card. He is legitimately talented. He flashed some upside as a rookie last year before going down to injury. He missed 6 games with a lacerated kidney, but he reclaimed the starting job in the playoffs and caught all 3 of his targets for 52 yards and a wide open touchdown against the Cowboys. And there's definitely potential for him to pop in any given week, but I don't think there's going to be much rhyme or reason to when he has a good game. When he scores a touchdown, I think will be kind of unpredictable. His ceiling is extremely touchdown dependent because even when he has good matchups, it might not correlate at all to fantasy success. There's just so many other weapons in the Packers offense that I can't fully talk myself into drafting Luke Musgrave with confidence. We all know that the Packers have a surplus of good young wide receiver talent on the roster. There's a 4-man rotation between Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, and Dontavian Wicks, and that's going to demand the majority of targets on a weekly basis. And with the addition of Josh Jacobs and Marshawn Lloyd in this backfield replacing Aaron Jones, I think the Packers running backs are definitely going to eat up far more than just 5 total touchdowns like they combined for last year. There were very few running back touchdowns last year in Green Bay, so that was a big factor for some of the success as well for Musgrave. And with less opportunity coming in the red zone, I find it hard to project more than 4 touchdowns for him next season. I think that's might be even asking too much. If he doesn't score a touchdown, he's going to have to be hyper efficient on the limited target volume that's headed his way. And I could easily envision an unusable stat line of 2 or 3 catches for 30, 35 yards many weeks next season. So I think from a floor standpoint, you're going to get the same value from Tyler Conklin, if not more, but you'll probably have a little more excitement when you draft Musgrave. You'll be praying for upside on a team that just has too many mouths to feed, though. And not only is it possible that wide receiver Bo Melton also gets in the mix, but it's also possible that backup tight end Tucker Kraft has more of a role as well. Kraft was very serviceable when filling in for Musgrave last year. In those 6 games when Kraft was the starter, he averaged 3.8 catches per game for 47 yards per game and 2 touchdowns. He averaged 8.6 points per game in half PPR when he monopolized all of the Green Bay tight end snaps and targets last season. Meanwhile, in 10 games as the starter, Musgrave only averaged 5.7 points per game because Kraft was also mixing in and out of the lineup in those games. So that's what caps his upside. Kraft is not going away, and Kraft is worthy of getting on the field. On the bright side, Kraft has been on the PUP list with a pec injury this summer, but he's also nearing a return to practice, and he's likely going to be ready for week 1. I don't think that injury really plays a big factor next season. So while there's definitely some appeal to drafting Musgrave, unless Kraft gets hurt, he's never going to see a full bevy of snaps, and he's also just in too much of a crowded offense to really pay off. I see too many red flags, and the path for success is just too narrow for me to buy into. I'd rather avoid drafting him at tight end 17, pick 146 overall. I'd rather just take TJ Hockenson 3 picks earlier, or just wait for Tyler Conklin 2 rounds later. At number 19, though, I have Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots, and honestly, I kind of feel risky ranking him this high, but last year he was their only viable receiver in the red zone. He played only 14 games, but scored 6 touchdowns, and that's what we're looking for this deep in the tight end rankings, some touchdown upside. It's worth noting, though, that 3 of his touchdowns were scored in the 3 games that he played with Bailey Zappi, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he did score them at the end of the equation. However, once Zappi started targeting him more, that's obviously when he got injured, and at the age of 29, injuries could definitely crop up again. He turns 30 in December, and he did struggle to stay healthy to start his career. He missed 25 games in his first 5 seasons with the Chargers, but he did also play all 17 games in his previous 2 seasons with the Patriots in 2021 and 2022. The situation, though, in New England is very dicey this year. Rookie quarterback Drake May has struggled to outperform Joe Milton in practice. At worst, though, Jacoby Brissett is just as bad as Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi were, so maybe he's exactly as good as he was last year, Hunter Henry, that is. Brissett doesn't really move the needle overall, but there's definitely more target competition this year in the Patriots wide receiver room. I'm very high on rookie wide receiver Jalen Polk. Rookie Javon Baker has also gotten some camp buzz. Pop Douglas looks to find the end zone for the first time in year 2. Kendrick Bourne is back from a torn ACL, but he might get traded and replaced with Brandon Ayuk. That's also possible. Juju Smith-Schuster is still in the mix, and they also added veteran KJ Osborne on a $5 million contract this offseason. But at the least, they moved on from Mike Gesicki. I guess that's a positive, but I don't think it really matters. So despite investing in Hunter Henry for another 3 years, the Patriots gave him a $27 million contract with $15.8 guaranteed. There are very few reasons to actually trust him in your lineup this season. Best case scenario, he scores another 6 touchdowns, but even that feels like an overly optimistic projection. I'm not dying to draft him with an ADP of tight end 18, pick 158 on Underdog. I'd rather take Conklin going later. You're probably lying to yourself if you think Henry has any top 12 potential. Last player in this tier is arguably in a make-or-break season, though. My tight end 20 is Noah Fant of the Seattle Seahawks, and Fant has never broken out as a viable week-to-week starter in fantasy, despite being drafted in the first round by Denver in 2019. He's played 5 seasons, only missed 2 games total, but his best seasons were in 2020 and 2021, where he put up very similar stat lines with an average of 91 targets, 65 catches for 670 yards, and 3.5 touchdowns per year. He averaged 7.8 half PPR points per game during those 2 seasons, but since being traded to Seattle, he's taken a big hit in fantasy production, posting fewer targets each season than his rookie year. He scored 4 touchdowns 2 years ago, but last season only caught 32 catches for 414 yards and 0 touchdowns. He was unusable in fantasy at the tight end spot. He finished tied for 36 with only 3.4 points per game. But there is reason for optimism going into 2024. Offensive coordinator Shane Waldron is gone. He was replaced by Ryan Grubb, who led the Huskies out of Washington to a top 5 passing offense in college football last season. The Huskies did that on the back of 3 elite wide receivers, though, all of which who were drafted top 100 in the NFL this year. But he didn't ignore the tight end position completely. The number 4 target in Grubb's offense was tight end Jack Westover, who ironically was signed as an undrafted free agent by the Seahawks this offseason. Westover caught 46 catches for 433 yards and 4 touchdowns, but is worth noting that some of Westover's best games came when slot wide receiver Jalen McMillan was either hurt and missed games or simply used as a decoy coming back from injury. And so it is a little skewed. It might lead to Fant being a little injury dependent as well this season. But back to Fant. He's definitely having a role in this offense. Not only did he sign a 2-year, $21 million contract, making him the 10th highest paid tight end in the NFL, the Seahawks also let go of Will Dissly and Colby Parkinson in free agency this year. The 3-man tight end rotation was a big problem for Fant last year. According to PFF, Fant averaged only 22 snaps per game on passing plays in 2023. Meanwhile, Disley and Parkinson combined for an average 28 snaps per game on passing plays. So with no real competition on the depth chart, we could see Noah Fant's usage double this year, at least in terms of overall snaps. And it does offer him legitimate breakout potential. He might have the best statistical season of his career. However, if he doesn't, I think the Seahawks might cut him next year because despite the 2-year contract, only $11.5 million one of those seasons is guaranteed, and the team can easily move on from him if he has a disappointing season with a new regime in Seattle. He's never really gotten going in the Seahawks offense. So maybe Noah Fant is a league winner. His ADP is tight end 19, pick 162 overall on Underdog. I think he's worth taking a chance on. He's a fine investment at that price, but he has been rising. I preferred taking him when he was closer to around 17 or 18. And especially if you're stacking him with Geno Smith, he's worth taking, but I think it's pretty unlikely he's all of a sudden more than just a touchdown-dependent streamer, given the fact that Tyler Lockett, JSN, and DK Metcalf are still clearly above him in the target share. Unless someone gets injured, you're still just getting the number 4 target at best in an offense with a very mediocre, league average at best quarterback in Geno Smith. I just can't imagine he's going to vault his way up to tight end 12 without a significant increase in touchdowns this season, and I doubt that happens. So these top 20 are really the only ones I would consider taking in my draft, but most of them I think are undraftable. Once you hit Dalton Schultz, even TJ Hockenson, you could argue, is not worth drafting. There's going to be at least like 16 or 17 tight ends drafted in your league this year, so go ahead and take a gamble on some of these guys. I think Conklin is one of the most appealing, but you could talk me into Fant as well, or any of these guys. But I think if I'm going to have a backup tight end, I'd want it to be Freiermuth or TJ Hockenson above anyone else. And I'm not going to go too in-depth on the remaining tight ends throughout the league, but for the sake of this video, I am going to rank basically my top 35 overall. So let's rip through the rest of these guys. At number 21, I have Juwan Johnson of the Saints, and I was very high on him before he needed foot surgery in June. He might be ready for week 1 though, and there is a chance he does really pay off with almost an undrafted price on Underdog. With no Michael Thomas in New Orleans this season, there's definitely a lot of targets available, and I think that's why he's worth a legit flyer at the end of your draft. Last year, in 8 games without Michael Thomas as well, he averaged 7.2 points per game, and that would have ranked as tight end 15 on a per game basis last year. So if you're getting him at the end of the draft past the top 25 tight ends, why not gamble on him? I think he's a legit sleeper candidate. If he is able to stay healthy, he might be the number 3 target in New Orleans this year. He's behind Kamara and Olave, but there's a chance he's even above Rashid Shaheed. That's not saying much, though. Moving on to number 22, I have Mike Gesicki, who isn't someone I want to completely dismiss either. Playing with Joe Burrow always offers potential, and while he's been terrible the last 2 seasons, I don't want to read into the fact that the Patriots could never get him going last year. He was disappointing 2 years ago in Miami as well, although I think that might have just been due to the nature of Mike McDaniel's offense completely neglecting the tight end position. I think he'll score a few random touchdowns this year, kind of like a CJ Uzoma, some big breakout games, but with recent reports that Andre Yoshivas might be beating out rookie Jermaine Burton for the number 3 wide receiver role in Cincinnati after the departure of Tyler Boyd, I think that does open the door for Gesicki to emerge as the number 3 target for Joe Burrow. With Boyd leaving, there's 98 vacated targets from last year, and there is a path, albeit a slim one, that Gesicki can reclaim some fantasy value he showcased just 3 years ago. It's also possible that he's washed, and the Bengals tight ends have never really offered much fantasy consistency since the days of Tyler Eifert being healthy back in 2015. So good luck with Gesicki. You're going to need it. Speaking of good luck, there is some sneaky upside for a tight end going undrafted, given the number 2 target role in Denver is completely up for grabs. I do view Greg Dulcich as a potential flyer. An injury-plagued season for Dulcich made everyone forget that he was being drafted in the top 130 overall for the majority of the offseason last year. Just 1 year ago, a lot of people were hyped on Dulcich. It's a long shot to work out, but it's not impossible. He has been getting some decent reports lately out of camp, and one of these tight ends that we completely forget about drafting will have value this year, it could easily be him. There's about 90 targets available with the departure of Jerry Jeudy. It's also possible that Jelani Woods is the tight end that goes undrafted we all pick up off of waivers later on. He was also injured just like Dulcich all of last year in Indianapolis. The athletic freak has a chance to be a major contributor in the red zone and take on a Mo Alley Cox type of role for Anthony Richardson. He's still very young, and he appears to be the runaway favorite for tight end 1 snaps in the Colts offense this year. It's kind of a crowded run-first team, however, but betting on Shane Steichen isn't a bad bet. The Colts threw 119 targets to the tight end position combined last season when he was off the field with injury. And although it was distributed to 4 different players, it might be mostly consolidated. We might see 80 plus targets for Jelani Woods this year. We might never see weekly value though for him, given they also drafted A.D. Mitchell. At number 25, I have Colby Parkinson of the Rams, who did lose Tyler Higbee to injury in their playoff loss to Detroit, so that's why they brought in Parkinson to step in for him. Despite being completely unproven, he is now the 16th highest paid tight end in the NFL, and the Rams like to run 3 wide receiver sets with only 1 tight end the majority of the time, and also keep their starters on the field as much as possible so that they do not tip their play calling based on the personnel on the field. So we could see a massive amount of snaps for Parkinson this season, especially if Higbee never gets fully healthy. But this feels like a long shot. I'd rather bet on someone who is either much younger like Jelani Woods or has actually put up somewhat decent stats in the past like Juwan Johnson. Parkinson has never done anything when he was a Seattle Seahawk. But at number 26, I think one of the biggest avoids at tight end would be Cade Otton of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I might be underrating him, but personally I'm completely staying away because of the addition of Jalen McMillan that I view as a very legit player. He is already making a splash in training camp, and he makes this already small target share for Otton likely to decrease. Otton is extremely touchdown dependent, and unless Mike Evans gets hurt, I recommend completely staying away. I think there's almost no starting value for Otton this year. At number 27, I'm also staying away from Chig Okonkwo of the Tennessee Titans. Okonkwo already took a hit in fantasy production when the Titans made the switch from Tannehill at quarterback to Will Levis last year. And with Calvin Ridley, Tyler Boyd, and a new coaching staff coming into the fold, I do not want to bet on him at all. DeAndre Hopkins did just get hurt to his knee. He might miss a little bit of time, but I think he'll be back on the field as late as week 2, and I don't think it really moves the needle that much on the outlook for Chig. I am not interested in Okonkwo this season. But at number 28, this is a potential league winner, Isaiah Likely of the Baltimore Ravens. He was last year, but unless Mark Andrews gets hurt again, there is no actual guarantees that Likely gets real opportunity and targets this year. I just do not know where that value is going to come from unless Andrews gets hurt. So you can argue that he earned more of a role after performing so well as the starter last season. I do think it's possible, but until I see it, I'm not willing to bet on it. And I'm willing to pick him up off of waivers if he does prove me wrong in the early weeks, but I'm not drafting him. I'm not going to stash him when I can get a handcuff running back that could pop off as early as week 1. I'd rather wait and see with Likely than take him right away. So he strictly has contingent upside. Otherwise, there is no weekly value in my mind. I'm going to pass unless it's best ball. At number 29, though, I have Dawson Knox of the Buffalo Bills, and he is still one of Josh Allen's favorite teammates. He's also the 12th highest paid tight end in the league, so I don't want to completely dismiss him, but I think with all of the volume available in Buffalo in a revamped offense, there's a chance I might be far too low with this ranking. I kind of view 21 through 30 all in the same tier, though. You could put him at 21. I wouldn't fault you at all. But this team drafted Kincaid in round 1 last year for a reason. I think Kincaid is clearly their future. And even if Knox lines up in a lot of 2 tight end sets, he's more of just a blocker for the Bills rather than a go-to target. I'm willing to leave him on the waiver wire until he proves something. But if Kincaid were to go down, he could offer top 15 value, maybe even top 10 value in the Bills offense. I think he's strictly a contingently upside type of guy, though. You need Kincaid to go down for him to really do anything. Maybe, though, I'm wrong. Maybe he scores a lot of touchdowns. It is possible, but given Kincaid's youth, I doubt anything happens and improves Knox stock for fantasy purposes. But number 30, I have Hayden Hurst of the LA Chargers, and one of these Chargers tight ends is going to have a role. Hayden Hurst is familiar with the Greg Roman offense, so he is my pick to offer the most fantasy value here, but it's not guaranteed that he has good chemistry with Justin Herbert, especially with Herbert currently in a walking boot for at least 2 weeks. I also worry about the red zone role for the massive Darnold Parham. There's a chance that Parham is the guy that you want, actually, but until we see it, I think it's kind of a little too risky to bet on either guy. If Hurst can stay on the field, though, there's potential he overtakes DJ Chark as the number 3 target in this offense. We will see. There's some underrated sneaky upside for these Chargers tight ends. I would prefer Hurst, but I'd rather wait to see it happen. At number 31 and 32, I have the Commanders tight ends, Zach Ertz and Ben Sinnott, and I am not drafting a Washington tight end. I think Zach Ertz will be very annoying for anyone who drafts rookie Ben Sinnott. That's why I'm staying away. But Sinnott might have some upside next season once Ertz is retired. But at 33 and 34, I have Daniel Bellinger and Theo Johnson, the 2 Giants tight ends, and I'm not taking a chance on them either. Without Darren Waller, maybe one of them emerges, but I have no faith in Daniel Jones. I think it's all shit show. If you don't take Malik Neighbors, nobody other than Singletary has value. But at 35, I have Jonnu Smith, the last starting tight end I'm going to mention here. I'm not drafting a Miami Dolphins tight end. Mike McDaniel has refused to value that position in his offense. And Jonnu isn't even a lock to beat out Durham Smythe as their tight end 1. Avoid completely this tight end core. So that's it for this video. I ripped through my top 35 tight end rankings, every single starter at the position, along with a few backups as well. And it was a good, fun, interesting video, but really you're looking for top 10 guys if you really want to compete. Check out my previous video for more in-depth analysis on those top 10. But here's a reminder of the full tier breakdown. After the top 3 tiers, we have Bowers, Goedert, and Freiermuth. In the next tier, TJ Hockenson in a tier of his own, followed by a tier of 6 with Schultz, Kmet, Conklin, Musgrave, Hunter Henry, and Noah Fant. And then the next 7, I think, are all somewhat viable tight end 3 options for you. But then I think these handcuffs in likely Knox and Hurst are arguably more interesting overall. And then Ertz through Jonnu Smith, I have no interest at all. There's no fucking chance that works out in any way, shape, or form. And the last guy I forgot to mention is Jatavian Sanders, who's my tight end 42. I almost completely forgot about him. I have zero interest in the Panthers tight ends either, although I did like Jatavian Sanders coming out of college. Maybe he proves me wrong. I'm not going to draft him, though. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button for more, and I'll be giving you all of my quarterback rankings later on this week. After that, we'll update all the rankings and give you some must-draft sleepers and definitely some players to avoid drafting as well. So we're getting close. It's early August, and before you know it, it'll be week 1 of the season. Very excited for this year. Hit that subscribe button if you don't want to miss out, and join me along the way. But my name's Adam Riancho. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.